Hello, good evening, and welcome to Sheffield Live. My name is Baile Jallo, and we are African Voices platform. Last weekend, hundreds of climate activists took part in a rally in Sheffield city centre, calling on world leaders to act quickly to tackle what they described as climate emergency. The rally was part of a global day of action held in cities and towns across the world. At the rally, I spoke to some people who have serious concerns about the lack of support by Western countries to developing nations who are currently worst affected by the climate crisis, despite being the low emitters.
Here today representing Christian Aid, but I'm also a Methodist as well, and there's some of our Methodist Justice and Peace group here, because we believe climate injustice is such an important issue, and as a Christian, you know, we believe justice is the bedrock of our Christian faith. So we're here to say there needs to be justice, and climate injustice is one of the biggest sins, I would say, in our society now.
When you say justice, what do you mean?
Well, the thing is that the rich countries have basically got themselves rich by burning coal, and that's poisoned the atmosphere. But of course, it's the people in the developing countries who are suffering from that most. You know, people in low-lying countries like Bangladesh, people living on the edge. You know, subsistence farmers and that. They're the people who are suffering the most from climate change. But they didn't contribute it. So people like in the Horn of Africa who are starving to death at the moment probably only contribute a fraction of the CO2 that we do. People in Somalia, for example, contribute about 0.4 of a tonne per capita. In our country, it's 4 tonnes. It's 10 times as much. So that's injustice. We're making the world difficult to live in, and they're suffering, not us.
Speaking of developing countries or the global south, as you mentioned, the global south contributes less than 3% of the world's emission. So what action would you like to see the global north or the developed countries do?
Well, the developed countries need to accept that they have some responsibility for having caused the problem in the first place. So they need to be helping the developing countries, the global south, they need to compensate for the losses that they've suffered, and also help them essentially to sort of leapfrog fossil fuels and go straight into sustainable development and sustainable energy. And it's up to the rich developed countries who've poisoned the atmosphere to do that. And we need to be going there and saying, we're sorry, we've caused these problems, we're going to help you with some money.
Last year at COP26 in Glasgow, there were so many pledges, billions of dollars or millions of dollars. And this year as well, so much has been pledged. Do you trust politicians that they will act on their pledges?
Well, I trust politicians only to the extent that if we keep the pressure upon them, they'll stick with their pledges. I'm a little bit cynical about whether they'd stick with their pledges if we didn't, but this is why we're here today. We need to keep the pressure up and say, you've made pledges, now act on them.
This has been going on for over 26 years, you know, and yet many of these countries like China, countries like India, the United States and other developed countries are still, I'm not saying in climate denial, but they still burn quite a lot of fossil fuel.
Yeah, they do.
And yet, as you said, developing countries like in the global south, they are suffering the consequences of it. What do you think really needs to be done in order for these developed countries or countries like China and others to act to stop what they are currently doing in order to improve renewable energy?
Well, I mean, I can't say what China or India, you know, we can't directly influence them, but all we can do is raise our voices in the situation we are and try and do what we can, and hopefully there'll become a groundswell of opinion and pressure to put pressure on these other countries. I mean, you're right, the CO2 emissions are actually going up this year, you know, and all we can do is do what we can. Attend things like this, put pressure on our politicians, and sort of get the UK government at least to start putting pressure on other countries. And we just need to try and come together.
And do you think protests like this or rallies like this will make a difference?
I think they do. Yeah, I think they do. I think people sort of can sometimes say, oh, what difference are you making? But at least we're here trying, you know. I mean, sitting at home isn't going to work, is it? That definitely won't work. So I'm not sure how much pressure this will do, but it's a lot better than me sitting at home.
And locally or nationally, bringing this into national perspective, in terms of the UK, how do you think we are doing?
Well, certainly the government seems to be sort of saying the right things, but again, we just need to keep the pressure up. They don't just say them, but they do them.
I'm here because we're on the middle weekend of COP27, and I'm a climate educator and I'm very aware of the science of climate change, and I'm also aware that the political action that we're hearing from COP27 and that we've heard for the last 26 years with these events is just a lot of hot air and no action behind it, or very little action. So I'm here not because I feel what we're going to do here today is going to change what happens in Egypt right now, but because I feel it's important that people can come together to express their frustration and their anger and their care for what is not going on in terms of the political action and for what is needed in terms of, you know, the care of life on this planet.
As you mentioned, you've come all the way from West Yorkshire. This must be very, very important to you. So how frustrated are you, as you allege, that political leaders are not doing enough?
Frustration is a very soft word for how I feel about it. There's so many feelings in me around what isn't happening politically and what is happening physically and socially to the ecosystems of this planet and the people of this planet and all other life on this planet. And this is, I feel so passionately that I do a lot more than just travel from West Yorkshire to Sheffield to do a protest on a Saturday afternoon. You know, I take part in a lot of activism around trying to get the proportional response to the climate crisis that we need from political leadership.
As a climate educator, from my understanding, many people are not aware or don't understand how dangerous it is right now. How dangerous it is?
This is an existential threat. So this is a threat to all life on this planet. So, you know, it is one of the most dangerous things that is happening right now, and it's happening because of human activity, and it's happening because of things that we've known about for a long, long time, namely the extraction and burning of fossil fuels.
As we speak right now, political leaders are currently deliberating in Egypt about climate action. They've been there for about a week now. In terms of what you have heard so far, what's your take on it?
Well, let me share what I heard yesterday, is that there are 636 delegates in the COP process that are related to fossil fuel companies. So to me, this is the indication of what is happening in this COP process. There is a lot of lobbying from people that have a vested interest in continuing the fossil fuel economy, and that this is also what is funding a lot of political leadership in this world that we live in. So to me, the words that are coming out of the COP process right now are meaningless until they get rid of the fossil fuel lobby and they actually listen to the voice of civil society, which is what's going on here.
Let's bring this back into local perspective or national perspective. Our own Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was there a week ago. In terms of his pledges, what do you think of it?
They're hollow. So Rishi Sunak turned up at COP like as if he'd been shoved from behind, you know. He wasn't going to go because he said there was more domestic challenges to face. There is no bigger challenge than the climate crisis, because this is an interrelated crisis of everything that is happening and unravelling in our world. So his promises are meaningless because his government are also giving out new oil and gas licences right now in the North Sea. If we are giving out new licences to extract fossil fuels, those fossil fuels are going to be burnt, and they are locking us in to a future which is unimaginably horrific. We are heading for catastrophe if we follow the leadership of this government right now.
I'm not in any how trying to defend the government here, but do you understand the political and economic crisis that are currently happening across the world? And Britain alone, or the UK alone, cannot make a difference. If you look at the highest climate fossil fuel burners, people like China, India, America, if they are not doing enough, whatever the UK does will not make any difference?
I'm afraid that not making a difference is, for me, a very flawed argument, because we in the UK are at the heart of the industrial revolution that has spread around this planet. And if we can start something that has had such a massive impact, we should also be leading the way in terms of how we transition to something a much better.
Sorry to interrupt you there. Speaking of the Industrial Revolution, do you think the influence that the UK had then, the UK still have similar influence?
Well, that's a whole nother debate, isn't it, about whether we have any standing in political respect around the world, because right now we're being led by a government that is in utter shambles, and we've instigated the Brexit process, which this is some lovely sounds coming out. You know, we've lost a lot of respect that we may have had, and for me a lot of that respect was misguided anyway, because of how we've been treating the world with our leadership around our colonial behaviours, which continue to this day and are the underpinning of the climate crisis. This is a climate, ecological and social crisis underpinned by a colonial mindset.
And lastly from me, what will you see or what will you like to see happen? What action do you want to be taken?
I would like governments around the world to tell the truth about what is happening to the planet in terms of the climate crisis. I would like them to act on that truth, act on what the science is telling us, and I'd like them to do that through instigating citizens' assemblies that have legally binding policy-making decision powers. This crisis cannot be dealt with in the current political paradigm.
Well, I'm here to voice my concern and join all, be counted as someone who isn't okay with what governments and corporations and the powerful in the world are doing not doing about climate change and are doing to cause climate change.
How important is this to you?
Well, in terms of there's always going to be things that are more immediately concerning to you, or to me specifically, as someone who's privileged enough not to be very directly impacted by the climate crisis. But at the end of the day, in terms of humanity as a whole and human history, this is the most important thing that's going on.
You've got a banner here that says, "How many cops to arrest climate chaos?"
Yeah.
Where did that come from, and also how long did it take you to do?
Well, I didn't make it myself. I wasn't actually involved in the process, but I would imagine it took a while. I guess it's a play on words to do with, the COP27 trying to prevent climate change, and I guess the arrests of climate activists, disrupting daily life to try and bring attention to the climate crisis.
Speaking of the arrest of climate activists, in terms of what happened a couple of days ago, what's your take on it, and in terms of the arrest as well?
I think I'm on a very personal level, I'm not sure if I support certain tactics, but at the end of the day, it annoys a lot of people, but the more people it annoys, the more people it gets talking. And those people are talking about how much they hate these people, but then they're talking about climate change. And it does force the issue to the front of the public conversation,
So I guess we're just really fed up of inaction on tackling climate change. So there's yet another COP27 we're on now, and nothing's happened since the last one. So just fed up of inaction from the government and from world leaders.
You are a young lady. You've got a long way to go. How important is this to you?
Oh, massively. I mean, it's not just our futures, but if we have children, it's our children's futures. And also it's more than just people. It's, we're taking the planet away from animals and wildlife, and I just don't think that's morally or ethically right.
As we speak, world leaders are currently deliberating in Egypt and there has been so many pledges, but as you mentioned there, for 26 years now, nothing or not much has been happening. Do you trust what they are talking or what they are pledging?
I mean, until they start taking profit out of the equation and accept that infinite growth on a finite planet is not a possible concept, then I think we're just going to keep hearing empty promises. We need to put climate change before any kind of profit or ego if we're going to see any progress.
I spoke to someone earlier who spoke of climate justice. Is it something that sounds familiar to you? Is it something that you relate to?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm guessing they mean the fact that a lot of the world emissions are caused by developed, rich countries, and but the countries that are the poorest are the most affected, and that is a huge injustice that we all need to take responsibility for.
And speaking of responsibility, what do you think needs to be done?
So I mean, individuals can always do a part, but really it needs to be a system changed, led by world governments quickly, and it's going to take a lot of quite a kind of bold step for us to ever address any of these problems, or we're all just going to keep suffering, basically.
And you've got a banner here that says the climate is changing. Why aren't you? Did you do it?
Yeah, we made this, yeah. I mean, the U's kind of aimed at individuals and government and world leaders, so yeah.
And here, are you talking to people on a personal level, or you talking to the system?
Yeah, both, definitely, because individuals can make changes, but often the government blame individuals as though it's an individual responsibility, but actually it's the responsibility of world leaders more than it is of individuals.
There are lots of people here today, but still there are also so many people across the world who are still in climate denial, who think, it's just a bunch of people who have got nothing to do out there talking about climate change. What would be your message to them?
I think people often say that, and it's actually coming from fear rather than from that being their genuine belief. It's a really difficult problem to face up to think that the planet you live on is collapsing, and so it's easier for people to pretend there's no problem. So I think that's usually what's happening. But my message to them is that unless we all stand up, the government aren't going to do anything, because they're the ones making huge profits out of people's suffering.
The system is not just not working. Lots of people say, it's just not working. No, it is. It's doing exactly what it wants to do. It wants to create profits over people, profits over our planet. And we have to argue against that. And that's why millions of us are out on the streets in this country and around the world to call out the farcical leaders at COP27. Because when you look at it, in terms of the Horn of Africa, we're seeing millions of people living in horrendous situations due to the climate. They are starving. We are seeing in this country, the 5th largest country in the world, people having to queue up at food banks, people who work, not just people living in poverty. We are seeing around the world, and this is where we have to argue that we have to fight this on a global scale, not just on a national scale. We are seeing people in Pakistan who are fleeing horrendous floods, where 77% of the population are already living in poverty. And if you think this isn't a conscious, deliberate situation that the governments and the elite have put us in, you only have to look to Sri Lanka, where the Sri Lankan government are telling people that they need to stop eating more than one meal a day, when the IMF are telling them that they have to cut the labour rights, whilst they also cut the taxes of the multinationals in that country, where they're taking away and telling them that they have to privatise the public services and their health service. Does this ring a bell with you of what's happening in this country too? Never mind the human rights situation. And I think we have to look at this government, who are deliberately pushing through and bleeding as much oil and gas out of the North Sea, while they line the pockets of the fossil fuel companies, who are then draining us and making us pay and not be able to afford the millions of people around the world who aren't able to afford to put food on the table, to heat their homes, and to actually have decent jobs. And that's why Climate Justice Coalition is arguing for a global action, for global fight against the system. We aren't doing this alone. We are doing this with millions of people, as we've seen from the speakers, around the world. And we should be really proud that Sheffield and South Yorkshire and Yorkshire and Humberside are part of that. And I want to argue that what we have to do is we need to unite. We need to unite workers, we need to unite climate activists, we need to ignite community groups, the youth, faith groups, small farmers, and all oppressed people around the world, so that we can rise up and overthrow this rotten system, because this system isn't for us. We actually need to show a hope for a better system, a better world, a one where people can live in dignity, where people don't starve. We don't need to have people starving in the 21st century. We don't need this. And I think we have to lock and argue that we have to fight for decent jobs, decent housing, an end to the environmental catastrophe that is coming our way. We don't have 8 years. The people of Pakistan don't have 8 years. The people that are starving around the world don't have 8 years. We cannot sit in little rooms and negotiate anymore. We have to take to the streets and we have to fight. And that's what Climate Justice Coalition is about, bringing everybody together to make a stand, to go into your workplace, your communities, your faith groups, and actually stand up and say, this system isn't working. We are marching to make a change, and we're marching in solidarity with all those around the world today. So thank you so much for coming. This group are going to go and stand at the front with our banner, and then if you can all line up at the back, we'll continue the march, and in solidarity with all those around the world. A better world is possible.
Thank you for watching or listening to African Voices platform. My name is Baile Jallo. Join us again next week at the same time. Until then, have a good night.